Step away from the car right now.
Hey.
Hands where I can see him.
Whoa, officer, this is my car. I'm just trying to get it open. Key fob's dead.
Sure, just turn around. You're under arrest for grand theft auto.
No, listen.
Officer Neil Prescott was sitting in his patrol car when he saw Reggie Lawson, a black man, walking confidently toward a Rolls-Royce Ghost on a Wednesday afternoon, and his racist brain immediately decided that what he was watching was a black man about to steal an expensive car. When Lawson reached the vehicle, instead of opening it right away, he struggled because his key fob battery had just died and the car wasn't responding. That was when Officer Neil Prescott stormed out of his vehicle with his hand already on his holster and arrested Lawson for attempted grand theft auto on his own car, dismissing Lawson's calm explanation that the vehicle was his and that his key fob battery had simply died. Prescott took Lawson to the station, ignored every request to check inside the car, where the registration and wallet sat proving Lawson owned it, booked him and locked him in a cell. When a fellow officer suggested verifying Lawson's story before it went further, Prescott went to the impound lot himself, opened the Rolls-Royce using police tools, found Lawson's wallet and registration proving ownership, and chose to hide them rather than admit he was wrong. But what Prescott didn't know was that his captain had arranged the entire situation as a controlled test after months of racial profiling complaints against him, and that a planted camera inside the car had captured his evidence tampering in perfect detail. Before we go further, what city or country are you watching from? Drop it in the comments. We love seeing where you're tuning in from. If you believe driving an expensive car while black isn't a crime and shouldn't be treated as suspicious, then like this video and subscribe. Reggie Lawson walked out of a 3-story office building in the financial district at 2:45 on a Wednesday afternoon, loosening the top button of his shirt as he stepped into the afternoon sun. At 39 years old, Lawson had spent 12 years on the police force, the last 4 working as an undercover detective in the 3rd District. He was dressed casually but neatly, clean dark jeans, a pressed button-down shirt with the sleeves rolled to his elbows, and fresh white sneakers. He looked like any other professional finishing up a midday meeting, which was exactly the point. He'd just spent 2 hours in a meeting with his captain finalizing the details of an operation that neither man could discuss openly, and now he was heading back to his car to wrap up the day. Lawson walked down the sidewalk with the relaxed confidence of someone who knew where he was going and had no reason to be nervous. His Rolls-Royce Ghost was parked at the curb about 30 meters ahead, a midnight black beauty that he'd saved for over 3 years to purchase. It was his one major personal indulgence, bought with his own money after closing a career-defining case that earned him a significant commendation. He was proud of that car. Not in a showy way, but in the way a man is proud of something he worked hard to earn. He reached into his pocket as he approached the car and pulled out his key fob, pointing it at the Ghost and pressing the unlock button as he walked the last few steps toward the driver's door. Nothing happened. Lawson pressed the button again, closer this time, pointing the fob directly at the car. The door didn't respond. He pressed it a 3rd time and frowned slightly and then looked at the fob in his hand. The battery. It had been acting up for the past week and he'd meant to replace it but kept forgetting. He pressed the button one more time, harder, closer, knowing it sometimes worked if he got close enough. Still nothing. What Lawson didn't know was that 30 meters away, sitting in a patrol car on the opposite side of the street, Officer Neil Prescott had been watching him since he stepped off the curb from the office building. Prescott was a white officer in his mid-40s with 15 years on the force and a history of complaints that his supervisors had consistently failed to act on. He had a square jaw, close-cropped gray hair, and the kind of absolute certainty in his own judgment that comes from spending 15 years never being seriously held accountable for anything. The moment Prescott saw Lawson, a black man walking with purpose toward a Rolls-Royce Ghost, his eyes narrowed. He sat up straighter in his seat, his coffee forgotten in the cup holder beside him. In Prescott's 15 years of policing, his racist worldview had calcified into something he considered instinct. He called it reading the street. What it actually was racial profiling dressed up in professional language. And right now, every alarm in his prejudiced mind was firing. Prescott watched Lawson reach the car and press the key fob. Watch the car not respond. Watch Lawson press it again and again. And what Prescott saw was not a man frustrated by a dead battery. What Prescott saw was a black man failing to break into an expensive car. His mind had already written the story before a single fact had been established. The conclusion came first. A black man trying to steal a Rolls-Royce. Everything else was just detail. Prescott put his coffee down, opened his patrol car door, and stepped out onto the street. His right hand dropped to his holster as he crossed the road with long, deliberate strides. Lawson had his back turned, still working the key fob, pressing it from different angles, trying to coax enough power from the dying battery to unlock the door. "Step away from the vehicle," Prescott's voice cut through the afternoon air like a blade. "Step away right now. Hands where I can see them." Lawson spun around and immediately saw the officer with his hand on his holster, face rigid with authority, walking toward him like he'd already made every decision that needed to be made. Lawson's detective brain processed the situation in about 2 seconds flat. He knew exactly what was happening and exactly why. He raised both hands slowly, his key fob visible in his right hand, and kept his voice completely calm. "Officer, there's no problem here. This is my car. My key fob battery just died. That's all this is." Prescott didn't slow down. "Sure it is. You got ID?" "My ID is in my wallet, which is inside the car," Lawson said, his voice measured and clear. "If you let me get into the car, I can show you everything. My wallet, my driver's license, and the registration. This car belongs to me." Prescott stopped about 4 feet away and looked at Lawson the way a man looks at something he's already decided is worthless. "You're telling me your ID is inside the car you were just trying to break into?" "I wasn't breaking in," Lawson said, keeping every trace of frustration out of his voice. "I was trying to unlock my own car with my key fob. The battery is dead. That's the only issue here. Everything that proves this car is mine is sitting right inside it." Prescott's expression didn't shift by a single degree. "And I'm supposed to believe a black man owns a Rolls-Royce Ghost." He said it flatly, not even as a question, just as a statement of what he considered to be obvious absurdity. Lawson looked at him steadily. "Yes, because I do. And I'm telling you, if you check inside that car, everything you need to confirm that is right there." "What I see," Prescott said, moving his hand from his holster to his handcuffs, "is a black man who was caught trying to break into an expensive vehicle in front of a police officer. That's attempted grand theft auto. Turn around." "Officer, please listen to me," Lawson said, keeping his hands raised. "I'm telling you that this car belongs to me. I have proof. It is right inside that vehicle. All you have to do is check." "Turn around," Prescott repeated, his voice carrying the finality of someone who has already stopped listening. Lawson took a slow breath and turned around. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, tighter than necessary, and Prescott began walking him toward the patrol car, one hand gripping Lawson's arm with more force than the situation remotely called for. "I can tell you exactly what's in that car," Lawson said as Prescott put a hand on his head and pushed him into the back seat. "My wallet is in the center console. My registration is in the glove compartment. My name is on both of them. This is a mistake." Prescott closed the door without responding and walked back to the Rolls-Royce, looked at it for a moment, then called in the vehicle to be towed to the impound lot before getting back into his patrol car. At the station, Lawson was processed with the same efficiency as any other arrest, fingerprinted, photographed, stripped of his personal belongings, which in this case amounted to his phone, his keys, and the dead key fob. He was taken to a holding cell and the door was locked behind him. Lawson sat on the metal bench and looked at the ceiling. He was a detective. He knew how this worked. He knew that staying calm and consistent was the only way through this. He'd been telling the truth since the moment Prescott approached him, and he would keep telling it until someone listened. For the next hour, nobody listened. Prescott moved through the station with the energy of someone who'd made a good arrest and knew it. He filed his initial report, described the encounter, and logged Lawson as a suspect in attempted grand theft auto. Then a fellow officer named Danny Walsh, who had overheard parts of the story while Prescott was processing Lawson, approached the desk with a careful expression. Walsh was younger than Prescott, mid-30s, and had learned to choose his words carefully when dealing with his senior colleague. "Neil," Walsh said, "that guy in holding. He kept saying his registration is in the car. The car's at impound now. It might be worth running the plates or checking inside before we go much further with this." Prescott looked at Walsh with the patient contempt of someone who considers themselves superior. "Walsh, I arrested that man in the act. I watched him trying to break in. I don't need to check the car to know what I saw." "I know, but—" "I know a criminal when I see one," Prescott said, cutting him off. "And what I saw was a criminal. The car is evidence. We'll process it properly." Walsh opened his mouth, then closed it. He'd pushed as far as he was willing to push against a 15-year veteran. He went back to his desk. Prescott sat back in his chair for a moment, then stood up. He wasn't going to check the car because Walsh suggested it. He was going to check the car because he wanted to confirm what he already knew. He drove to the impound lot, found the Rolls-Royce Ghost in the row of recently towed vehicles, and used department tools to unlock the door. The interior of the car smelled like leather and cologne. Clean, well-maintained, personal. Prescott leaned across to the center console and opened it. Lawson's wallet was right there, exactly where he'd said it would be. Prescott picked it up and opened it. Driver's license, credit cards, cash. All in the name of Reggie Lawson, with a home address in the city. Prescott then reached across to the glove compartment and opened it. The registration was folded neatly inside. He unfolded it and read it. Rolls-Royce Ghost. Registered owner, Reggie Lawson. The same name on the driver's license. The same man sitting in a cell at the station. Prescott sat in the driver's seat of the Rolls-Royce and stared at the registration in his hands for a long moment. The interior was quiet. The afternoon light came through the tinted windows at an angle, illuminating the document clearly. There was no ambiguity here. The car belonged to Lawson. He had arrested an innocent man. And then Prescott folded the registration back up, put it in his jacket pocket along with the wallet, and got out of the car. He drove back to the station and told the desk officer he hadn't found anything useful in the vehicle. He went back to his report and continued building a case against the man he now knew with absolute certainty was innocent. What Prescott didn't know was that mounted discreetly behind the rearview mirror of the Rolls-Royce Ghost was a small camera, no larger than a thumb, planted there before Lawson had even arrived at the financial district that morning. The camera had recorded every second of Prescott opening the wallet, reading the registration, folding it back up, and sliding it into his pocket. 20 minutes later, Prescott was called to the captain's office. He walked down the hallway, straightening his uniform, a small, satisfied expression on his face, expecting what he usually got after a solid arrest. Acknowledgement, maybe a few words of praise from Captain James Morrison, who had always seemed to appreciate decisive action in the field. Prescott knocked twice on the captain's office door and opened it. Captain Morrison was sitting behind his desk with the calm, unreadable expression of a man who has already made every decision that needs to be made. He looked up when Prescott entered but said nothing. And standing to the right of the captain's desk, dressed in clean dark jeans and a pressed shirt, with a detective's badge hanging around his neck like a statement, was Reggie Lawson. Prescott stopped walking. His hand was still on the door handle. The satisfied expression evaporated from his face completely, and what replaced it was something between confusion and the first cold wave of understanding that everything was about to collapse. "Captain," Prescott said carefully, "what's going on?" Captain Morrison gestured to the chair in front of his desk. "Sit down, Officer Prescott. We need to talk." Prescott sat down slowly in the chair in front of Captain Morrison's desk, his eyes moving between the captain and Reggie Lawson, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Lawson stood to the right of the desk, looking completely composed, his detective's badge hanging clearly around his neck, his expression showing nothing but calm certainty. The same man Prescott had handcuffed at a Rolls-Royce 3 hours ago was now standing in his captain's office as a free man with a badge. Captain Morrison leaned forward and clasped his hands on the desk. "Officer Prescott, I want you to meet Detective Reggie Lawson from the 3rd District. He's been working with me directly for the past 2 weeks. Prescott's jaw tightened, but he said nothing yet. His mind was racing through every possible exit from this situation and finding none. "For the past several months," Morrison continued, his voice calm and deliberate, "I have been receiving complaints from residents in your patrol area. Multiple complaints, all of them saying the same thing, that you have been stopping, detaining, and harassing black residents without cause. I needed to know if those complaints were true, so I asked Detective Lawson to help me find out." Prescott shifted in his chair. "Captain, with respect, that man was trying to break into a vehicle. I witnessed it myself. I made a legitimate arrest based on what I observed." Morrison looked at him steadily. "You watched a man try to unlock his own car with a key fob whose battery had died, and you concluded he was stealing it." "He was acting suspicious," Prescott said. "A black man approaching a Rolls-Royce, struggling to get in." "A man," Morrison interrupted firmly. "A man approaching his own car. The color of his skin is not probable cause, Officer Prescott. But let's move past the arrest because that's not actually the worst thing you did today." Prescott went very still. Morrison continued. "After you booked Detective Lawson and threw him in a cell, you went to the impound lot to check the vehicle. Isn't that right?" "I checked the car," Prescott said carefully. "I didn't find anything relevant to confirm his story." Lawson spoke for the first time since Prescott had entered the room. His voice was quiet and even. "You found my wallet in the center console. You found my registration in the glove compartment. You read both of them. You sat in the driver's seat of my car holding proof that I owned it, and then you put everything in your jacket pocket and drove back here and told your colleagues you found nothing." Prescott's face stayed rigid, but his eyes shifted slightly. "That's not what happened." Morrison reached forward and pressed a single button on his laptop. The screen turned toward Prescott and began playing footage from inside the Rolls-Royce Ghost. The camera angle was from behind the rearview mirror, looking directly into the interior of the car. The footage was clear and sharp. It showed Prescott leaning across to the center console, opening it, picking up the wallet, opening the wallet, reading the license, then reaching to the glove compartment, removing the registration, unfolding it, reading it. Then sitting quietly for a moment before folding the registration, placing it with the wallet, and sliding both into his jacket pocket, then getting out of the car. The office was completely silent as the footage played. Prescott watched himself on the screen and said nothing because there was nothing left to say. Morrison closed the laptop. That camera was planted inside the vehicle before Detective Lawson arrived at the financial district this morning. We recorded everything. Morrison's voice dropped to something colder. You didn't make a mistake today, Officer Prescott. You made a choice. You arrested a man because he was black and driving an expensive car. Then you went to the impound lot, found proof that you were wrong, and chose to hide it rather than admit it. That is not a mistake. That is evidence tampering. That is filing a false report. That is a criminal act committed by a police officer who was supposed to uphold the law. Prescott tried one more time. Captain, I genuinely did not see anything in that car that confirmed. Stop, Morrison said quietly. The single word carried enough weight to end the sentence completely. I just showed you the footage. I watched you read that registration with my own eyes. Do not sit in my office and lie to my face after what I just played for you. Prescott closed his mouth. Morrison stood up slowly and straightened his uniform. When he spoke again, his voice was final and absolute. Officer Neil Prescott, you are terminated from this department effective immediately. You will surrender your badge and your service weapon right now and place them on this desk. Your pension is under review pending criminal charges. You will be escorted from this building by officers who are not your colleagues and who have been briefed on what you did today. Prescott sat frozen in the chair. 15 years on the force. His pension, his career, everything he'd built was sitting in a pile of rubble that he had constructed himself with his own racism and dishonesty. Badge and gun, Morrison said. On the desk, now. Prescott unpinned his badge with the hands that were not entirely steady and placed it on the desk. He unholstered his service weapon, cleared it properly out of trained habit, and placed it beside the badge. Both sat on the captain's desk, looking impossibly final. Lawson reached into his jacket and produced a pair of handcuffs. He stepped forward and looked at Prescott directly, his expression showing no satisfaction, just the steady professionalism of an officer doing his job. Officer Neil Prescott, Lawson said clearly, you are under arrest for false imprisonment, evidence tampering, filing a false police report, and violation of civil rights under color of law. Stand up and put your hands behind your back. Prescott stood up slowly. He looked at Lawson for a long moment, the man he'd handcuffed at a Rolls-Royce 3 hours ago for the crime of being black and owning an expensive car, and then turned around and put his hands behind his back. The handcuffs clicked onto his wrists, the same sound he'd made when he arrested Lawson at the curb, the same cold metal, the same click of the lock engaging. Only this time it was Prescott's wrists inside them. Morrison watched from behind his desk without a word as Lawson walked Prescott to the office door and opened it. The hallway outside was quiet, but several officers who had heard that something significant was happening had positioned themselves nearby. They watched in stunned silence as Prescott was walked out of the captain's office in handcuffs by the man he'd arrested that afternoon. Walsh, the junior officer who had suggested checking the car and been shut down by Prescott, stood near the end of the hallway and watched his former colleague being taken into custody. He said nothing, but his expression showed that justice, however delayed by a few hours, had arrived exactly where it needed to. Prescott was processed at the same desk where he had processed Lawson 3 hours earlier. Fingerprinted, photographed, his personal belongings logged and bagged. Then he was walked to a holding cell and the door was locked behind him. The same concrete walls, the same metal bench, the same locked door. The only difference was who was sitting inside and why. The story broke publicly within 24 hours and hit like a wrecking ball. A police officer arrested a black detective for stealing his own Rolls-Royce, went to the impound lot and found proof the car belonged to him, hid the evidence, lied to his captain, and was then arrested himself by the same detective he'd wrongfully jailed. The combination of those facts alone made the story explosive, but what came next made it devastating. Captain Morrison held a press conference the following morning and released a carefully measured statement confirming the details of the operation and Prescott's termination and arrest. He was deliberate and precise, saying only what was confirmed and nothing beyond it. But the footage from inside the Rolls-Royce Ghost was subpoenaed as part of the criminal case, and within days it leaked to the media. The footage went everywhere. Every major news network played it. The clip of Prescott sitting in the driver's seat of Lawson's car, reading the registration, folding it back up, and sliding it into his jacket pocket became one of the most viewed pieces of police misconduct footage in the country's recent history. People watched it and watched it again because it showed something beyond racial profiling. It showed a police officer making a cold, deliberate decision to cover up his own racism rather than admit he was wrong. It was 47 seconds of footage that destroyed every possible defense Prescott could have offered. His attorney tried anyway. The defense argued that Prescott had acted in good faith based on what he observed, that the operation was an unfair entrapment setup, and that the footage was being taken out of context. The prosecution responded by playing the footage again, this time frame by frame, showing every moment of Prescott reading the registration clearly and deliberately before pocketing it. There was no context that changed what the footage showed. A man read a document that proved he was wrong and chose to hide it. That was the beginning and end of the defense. Internal Affairs opened a full review of Prescott's 15-year career, and what they found was a history that should have ended his employment years earlier. 34 complaints had been filed against him during his career. 29 of them came from Black or Hispanic residents. 18 were excessive force complaints, 16 from minorities. 12 were wrongful detention complaints, 11 from minorities. Every single complaint had been investigated and dismissed or resolved with nothing more than a written note in his file that was never seriously acted upon. 6 of those dismissed complaints came from people who had been detained or arrested by Prescott in situations that looked remarkably similar to what he'd done to Lawson. Black men and women stopped near expensive cars or in affluent areas, treated as automatic suspects, questioned aggressively, and in 3 cases arrested without adequate cause. 2 of those arrests had been dismissed by prosecutors who determined there was insufficient evidence to proceed. Prescott had faced no consequences for either of them. The people who had filed those dismissed complaints were contacted by investigators, and several agreed to give new statements. A black doctor who had been stopped and aggressively questioned while sitting in his own BMW outside his own home. A black business owner detained for 20 minutes while Prescott searched his vehicle without consent after seeing him park an expensive car on a street Prescott apparently decided he didn't belong on. A black college professor stopped 3 times in 6 months while driving through a neighborhood that Prescott patrolled, each time questioned about where she was going and why she was in that area. All of them had filed complaints. All of them had been told their complaints were unsubstantiated. All of them had moved on because they had no choice. Lawson's case gave their experiences weight and documentation they'd never had before. The criminal case against Prescott was built with the kind of precision that left no room for escape. The prosecution had the impound footage showing evidence tampering. They had the false police report Prescott filed claiming he found nothing in the vehicle. They had Lawson's testimony detailing every racist comment Prescott made during the arrest. They had Walsh's testimony confirming that Prescott had shut down a reasonable suggestion to verify Lawson's story before booking him. They had 34 complaints showing a pattern. And they had 47 seconds of footage that showed exactly who Neil Prescott was when he thought nobody was watching. Prescott's deposition was a study in a man running out a road. His attorney had coached him carefully, but there were questions that had no good answers. When the prosecutor asked him why he hadn't simply looked through the car window before arresting Lawson to see if there was any identification visible inside, Prescott had no answer. When asked why he found a man struggling with a key fob more suspicious than a man simply standing next to a car, he had no answer. When asked to explain what specifically made him conclude that Lawson was stealing the car rather than experiencing a technical malfunction, Prescott eventually said that Lawson just didn't look like someone who would own that kind of vehicle. The prosecutor let that answer sit in the room for a full 10 seconds before asking the next question. And what does someone who owns a Rolls-Royce look like, Officer Prescott? Prescott didn't answer. His attorney intervened. But the damage was permanent and on the record. Lawson gave a single press conference outside the 3rd District station where he worked. He stood straight and spoke without notes, his badge visible, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had been through something serious and come out the other side, with their dignity completely intact. Officer Prescott saw me walking toward my own car and decided I was a criminal before I had done a single thing wrong, Lawson said. He arrested me based on the color of my skin and the price of my car. When he went to the impound lot and found proof that he was wrong, he chose to hide it rather than do the right thing. That choice tells you everything you need to know about the kind of officer he was and the kind of thinking that drove every decision he made for 15 years on this force. Lawson paused, and his voice hardened to something cold and final. 34 people filed complaints against this officer. 29 of them were Black or Hispanic. Every complaint was dismissed. Every one of those people deserved better than what they got, and this department failed them repeatedly. I was fortunate enough to be in a position where the truth could be proven without question. Most people aren't that fortunate. That has to change. He stepped away from the microphone and took no questions. Prescott watched the press conference from a holding facility where he was awaiting trial, knowing that Lawson had just said in 2 minutes what his entire 15-year career had spent actively working against. Justice. Plain and simple and completely out of his reach. Neil Prescott's criminal trial began 5 months after his arrest and lasted 3 weeks. The prosecution presented a case so airtight that the defense spent most of its time trying to minimize damage rather than actually defend the charges. The impound footage was played for the jury in full and then played again frame by frame. Lawson testified with the precision of a man who had spent 12 years observing and documenting human behavior professionally, recounting every racist comment Prescott made during the arrest with exact detail and zero embellishment. Walsh testified about suggesting they verify the car ownership and being shut down by Prescott. The 6 other victims who had filed dismissed complaints testified about their own experiences with Prescott, building a picture of 15 years of systematic racial targeting that the department had repeatedly failed to address. The defense argued that the entire operation was entrapment and that Prescott had been set up to fail by his own department. The prosecution responded simply by playing the impound footage one final time and asking the jury a single question: was finding proof of innocence and choosing to hide it in your jacket pocket a setup, or was it a choice? The jury deliberated for 11 hours and returned guilty verdicts on all 5 counts: false imprisonment, evidence tampering, filing a false police report, deprivation of rights under color of law, and misconduct in office. At sentencing, the judge reviewed Prescott's 34 complaint history, the 6 other victims who had been failed by dismissed complaints, the deliberate evidence tampering caught on camera, and the false report filed to cover it up. The judge looked at Prescott directly before delivering the sentence and said, "You did not make a mistake. You made a series of calculated decisions rooted in racial bias and then compounded every one of them with deliberate deception. You abused the authority given to you by the public and used it as a weapon against the very people you were sworn to protect." The judge sentenced Prescott to 18 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after 14 years. At 46 years old, Prescott would be 60 years old at his earliest possible release. His pension was permanently revoked. His law enforcement certification was canceled for life. He would never wear a badge again. The police department faced immediate consequences as a result of the internal affairs review. Captain Morrison, who had handled the operation and the fallout with complete integrity, was commended by the city. However, the supervisors who had dismissed 34 complaints against Prescott over 15 years were not treated as kindly. 3 senior supervisors who had signed off on complaint dismissals without adequate investigation were formally disciplined. 2 were demoted. 1 was forced into early retirement. The department implemented mandatory independent review of all racial profiling complaints, removing the ability of individual supervisors to dismiss complaints without oversight. 22 other officers identified during the internal affairs review as having disproportionate complaint patterns involving minority residents were placed under enhanced supervision with quarterly reviews. 7 of them resigned rather than face the scrutiny. 4 were eventually terminated after further investigation revealed misconduct similar to Prescott's, though none is severely documented. Officer Danny Walsh, who had tried to stop the wrongful arrest by suggesting they check the car, received a formal commendation for professional conduct and sound judgment. He was promoted to senior officer and later became part of a newly formed community relations unit designed to rebuild trust between the department and the minority communities that had been failed for years. Prescott's wife filed for divorce 3 weeks after his conviction. His 2 adult children released a public statement saying they were deeply ashamed of their father's actions and expressed personal apologies to Lawson and all others affected by Prescott's conduct during his career. His house was sold to cover legal fees. He entered prison with nothing remaining of the life he had spent 15 years building on a foundation of racial bias and unchecked authority. Detective Reggie Lawson returned to active duty at the 3rd District with a formal commendation from the department for his role in the operation and his professionalism throughout the entire ordeal. He was promoted to senior detective within 8 months, the promotion he had already been in line for before the operation. He used a portion of a civil settlement reached with the city, which acknowledged the department's failure to act on prior complaints against Prescott, to establish a legal defense fund for victims of police misconduct who couldn't afford proper representation. The fund helped 41 people in its first 2 years, including several of the individuals who had filed dismissed complaints against Prescott and had never received justice or even acknowledgement that they had been wronged. Lawson worked with civil rights attorneys to reopen 3 of the cases where people had been wrongfully arrested by Prescott, and 2 of those individuals received formal apologies and financial settlements from the city. The impound footage became required viewing in police academies across 3 states. used specifically to train new officers on the difference between honest mistakes made under pressure and deliberate choices made to protect personal pride over professional integrity. The 47 seconds of Prescott reading the registration and pocketing it became a permanent fixture in discussions about how racial bias corrupts judgment at every stage of policing, not just in the initial encounter but in every decision that follows. 5 years after his arrest, Reggie Lawson was promoted to lieutenant detective, heading his own unit focused on complex undercover operations. His Rolls-Royce Ghost, returned from the impound lot with a full departmental apology, sat in his driveway every morning as a reminder of a Wednesday afternoon when a dead key fob battery and one racist officer's assumptions had set in motion a chain of events that changed an entire police department. Neil Prescott was still in prison with 9 years remaining before parole eligibility, known throughout the facility as the cop who arrested a detective for owning a car, hid the proof in his own jacket, and thought he was going to get away with it. The footage of him pocketing that registration still circulated online with millions of views, permanent and inescapable, following him into whatever future remained after his sentence was served. The lesson was unambiguous and brutal. Neil Prescott saw a black man in a Rolls-Royce, and his racism made the introduction for him before a single fact was established. Every decision he made after that was built on that first corrupt assumption, each one worse than the last, until he sat in a captain's office watching himself on camera holding the proof of his own wrongdoing. He had 18 years to think about the moment he chose to fold that registration and slide it into his pocket, instead of doing what every standard of law enforcement demanded. Justice, when it came completely and without mercy. If this story proved to you that racial bias in policing destroys everyone it touches, including the officer who practices it, share it with someone who needs to understand that racism is not just morally wrong, it is professionally fatal and legally catastrophic. What reforms would ensure that 34 complaints are never dismissed without proper investigation again? Drop your answers in the comments. And if you believe that owning an expensive car while black should never be treated as evidence of a crime, subscribe. We are bringing you more stories where accountability arrives exactly where it is needed, and racism costs everything it deserves to cost.